"Helen, you're back," Michael said with a grin as I walked into the living room. His overly casual tone immediately set off alarm bells. "I am," I replied cautiously, setting my suitcase down. Something about his smug expression didn't sit right with me. "What's with the smile?" "Oh, nothing," he said, waving his hand as if brushing off my question. Then with a flourish, he added, "Well, I suppose you'll find out eventually. I made a major business move while you were away." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of move?" He leaned back against the arm of the couch, his grin widening. "Your jewelry collection," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I sold it. Every piece. And before you get upset, let me just say, you'll thank me later. Your jewels funded my empire." I froze, my heart pounding as his words sank in. My jewelry collection, the pieces I'd spent years curating, some handed down from my mother and grandmother, others purchased with my own hard-earned money. Gone. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice low and trembling. Michael laughed, clearly misreading my tone. "I said I sold it, Helen. Do you know how much those diamonds were worth? Enough to jumpstart a venture that's going to put us on the map. It's brilliant, really. You should be proud." Proud? My hands clenched into fists as anger surged through me. "You had no right, Michael. That was my jewelry. Do you even realize what you've done?" He rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, it's not like you wore half of it. It was just sitting there collecting dust. This way, it's actually doing something useful." My name is Helen, and if there's one thing I've learned in my marriage to Michael, it's that his ambition always comes first. When we met, I admired his drive. He had big dreams, and I believed in them. But over the years, I started to see the cracks. How his charm masked a tendency to bulldoze anyone who got in his way. Still, I never thought he'd stoop this low. The jewelry collection wasn't just valuable. It was deeply personal. Every piece had a story, a connection to the life I'd built for myself. And now it was gone, just like that, because Michael had decided my possessions were his to use. But what Michael didn't know, what made his smug grin so infuriating, was that I wasn't as careless as he thought. A few months ago, after hearing about a string of local burglaries, I'd taken precautions. My most valuable pieces had discreet tracking devices embedded in their clasps. I forced myself to stay calm, hiding the storm of emotions brewing inside me. Michael thought he'd won, but the game had only just begun. That night, I sat in my bedroom, staring at the open drawer where my jewelry box used to be. The empty space felt like a void, a physical reminder of what Michael had stolen from me. The anger bubbling inside me was almost too much to contain. He hadn't just sold jewelry, he'd taken pieces of my history, things I could never replace. The sapphire ring my grandmother had given me on her 80th birthday. The diamond bracelet my mom wore on her wedding day. Even the gold pendant I'd bought for myself after landing my first big job. Every piece meant something, and Michael had tossed them away like they were nothing more than a stepping stone for his empire. My fingers hovered over my phone. I wanted to call him out right then and there, scream at him, demand answers. But I knew better than to confront him when I was this angry. Instead, I opened the tracking app I'd installed months ago. The screen lit up with a map, little red dots scattered across the city. My breath caught as I realized they were still active. My necklace was at a jewelry consignment store downtown. The bracelet? It had already moved to a warehouse in the industrial district. The app even showed timestamps, tracking the journey of my belongings as they changed hands. A grim sense of satisfaction replaced my anger. Michael might think he'd pulled one over on me, but I had something he didn't. Evidence. If the tracking data was accurate, I could not only find out where my pieces were, but also prove that Michael had stolen them. I picked up my phone and called Megan, my best friend and the one person I could always count on. "Megan," I said as soon as she answered, "you're not going to believe what Michael did." "What now?" she asked, already exasperated. I explained everything, the sale, his smug attitude, the tracking devices. By the time I finished, she was as furious as I was. "Helen, you have to go to the police," she said firmly. "I will," I said, feeling a flicker of determination. "First thing tomorrow." I ended the call and sat back, staring at the glowing dots on the screen. Michael had no idea what was coming, and for once I felt like I had the upper hand. The next morning I walked into the local police station, my phone in hand and my nerves wound tight. I'd never had to file a report like this before, but Megan's voice echoed in my head. "You have to go to the police." She was right. If I let Michael get away with this, he'd only push the boundaries further. At the front desk, a kind-looking officer greeted me. "How can we help you today?" "I need to report a theft," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Was it your property?" "Yes," I replied, taking a deep breath. "My jewelry collection. It was sold without my consent." The officer's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Let's get some details." He motioned for me to follow him to a desk, where I explained everything. Michael's actions, the value of the jewelry, and the tracking devices I'd installed. When I showed him the app, his expression turned serious. "This is excellent evidence," he said, jotting down notes. "If these tracking devices are active, we may be able to retrieve some of the items. Do you have a list of what was taken?" "I do," I said, pulling out a notebook I'd filled with every piece and its approximate value. It felt strange, almost surreal, as the officer read through the list. The sapphire ring, the diamond bracelet, the gold pendant. They were more than just numbers on a page. They were pieces of my life, and now they were scattered across the city because of Michael's greed. The officer, whose name tag read Detective Carter, looked up from his notes. "We'll start by verifying the locations of the tracking signals. If the items are where you say they are, this could be a straightforward recovery. However, since your husband sold them without your consent, this also constitutes fraud. Are you prepared to pursue charges?" I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "Yes," I said finally. "I want him held accountable." Detective Carter nodded, his expression resolute. "Good. Let's get started." As I left the station, a mix of emotions churned inside me. Relief, knowing the police were taking this seriously. Anger, remembering Michael's smug grin when he told me what he'd done. And most of all, determination. For years, I'd let Michael take and take, convincing myself it wasn't worth the fight. But this time was different. This time I was fighting back. By the time I got home, the adrenaline from filing the report had started to fade, leaving me with a mix of exhaustion and anxiety. I replayed the conversation with Detective Carter in my mind, wondering how Michael would react once he realized the police were involved. The thought didn't sit well. Michael had always been good at spinning situations to his advantage, turning himself into the victim no matter how egregious his actions were. I'd seen it before, how he could charm his way out of responsibility with a smile and a clever excuse. But this time, he didn't know I was one step ahead. That evening, Megan came over, a bottle of wine in hand. "Okay," she said, settling onto my couch. "Tell me everything. How did it go at the station?" I filled her in, from the evidence I'd shown Detective Carter to his plan to track down the pieces. She listened intently, her expression a mix of outrage and admiration. "You're handling this better than I would," she said when I finished. "If it were me, I'd probably be at his office flipping desks right now." I laughed despite myself. "Trust me, I've thought about it. But the police have the tracking data, and I think that's my best shot at getting everything back." "Good," Megan said, raising her glass. "To you, for not letting that smug jerk get away with this." The next day, I got a call from Detective Carter. "We've verified the locations of the items," he said. "2 are at a consignment store downtown, and another is in a warehouse. We've secured cooperation from the store owners and are moving forward with retrieval. I'll keep you updated as we progress." The relief was immediate. "Thank you," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "Does this mean I'll get them back?" "It's looking good," he replied. But the investigation is still ongoing. We've also flagged your husband's financial activities. I don't want to alarm you, but there may be more going on than just the jewelry sale. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? There are some unusual transactions linked to his business accounts, Detective Carter explained. We'll need to look into it further, but this could be bigger than we initially thought. As I hung up the phone, my mind raced. Michael hadn't just betrayed me. He might have been hiding an entirely different side of himself. The idea that Michael's betrayal could run even deeper haunted me for the rest of the day. I paced the kitchen, replaying Detective Carter's words. This could be bigger than we initially thought. What else had Michael been hiding from me? Later that evening, I decided to confront him. If there was more to this than the jewelry sale, I needed to know. When he walked through the door, his smug grin irritated me more than usual. He tossed his keys on the counter and said, "Busy day. What's for dinner?" I didn't even try to hide my anger. "Michael," I said, crossing my arms, "we need to talk. Now." His grin faltered, replaced by a wary expression. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "You stole my jewelry to fund your so-called empire, and now the police are investigating you." The color drained from his face, but he quickly tried to recover. "Police? What are you talking about?" "I didn't steal anything, Helen. That jewelry was just sitting there, collecting dust. I thought you'd be happy it was being put to good use." I shook my head, disgusted by his audacity. "Put to good use? Michael, you had no right to touch my things. And now the police are looking into your finances, and they think there's more to this than just the jewelry." His expression shifted, anger flashing in his eyes. "You went to the police?" he hissed. "You're turning this into a circus. Why couldn't you just talk to me like an adult?" "Because talking to you doesn't work," I shot back. "You always find a way to twist things or talk yourself out of trouble. This time, there's evidence, and you can't charm your way out of it." Michael stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You've made a huge mistake, Helen. If you think you can tear me down like this, you've got another thing coming." I didn't flinch. "No, Michael. The only mistake I made was trusting you, but that ends now." The silence between us was heavy as he glared at me, his confidence cracking. For once, he didn't have a snappy comeback or a smug excuse. He simply stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine anymore. This was about standing up for myself, for everything I'd let Michael take from me over the years. And I wasn't backing down. The next day, I received another call from Detective Carter. His tone was steady, but there was a weight to his words. "Mrs. Parker, we've recovered 3 of the items so far, including the diamond bracelet and sapphire ring. The rest are being traced to other locations, but we've hit an unexpected development." "What kind of development?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "We've uncovered financial transactions linked to your husband's business that suggest fraudulent activity. Some of these funds appear to overlap with the sale of your jewelry, but others involve external accounts that raise red flags. We're expanding the investigation." I sat down, the weight of his words pressing on my chest. Michael wasn't just selfish. He was reckless. "What does this mean for me?" I asked cautiously. "For now, you're not implicated," Detective Carter reassured me. "But it's important that you remain cooperative and provide any additional information we request. Your husband's actions could have serious legal consequences." I hung up and stared at the phone in disbelief. What had Michael gotten himself into? Selling my jewelry was bad enough, but fraud? I felt like I was living with a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. That evening, I called Megan. "The police think Michael's involved in something bigger," I said, pacing the living room. "They're looking into his business accounts." Megan didn't sound surprised. "Honestly, Helen, I'm not shocked. The way he carries himself, like the rules don't apply to him, it was only a matter of time before it caught up with him." "But how could I not have seen this?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I married him, trusted him, and now everything feels like a lie." Megan's tone softened. You couldn't have known, Helen. He's good at hiding things, at manipulating people. But this isn't your fault. You're doing the right thing by standing up for yourself." Her words gave me some comfort, but the anger and betrayal still churned inside me. Later that night, Michael came home. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an air of frustration and barely contained rage. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice low and venomous. "The police, the bank. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you've caused?" "I didn't cause this, Michael," I said, meeting his glare. "You did. And now you're finally facing the consequences." He laughed bitterly. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Helen." "You're right," I said calmly. "It's not over. But it's out of your hands now." For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The following morning, I received another call from Detective Carter. "Mrs. Parker," he began, his tone steady but serious. "We've recovered several more items from your jewelry collection. They were traced to a private auction house downtown." Relief washed over me. "Does that mean I'll get them back soon?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of hope and exhaustion. "Yes," Detective Carter confirmed. "We're working through the legal process to return the recovered items to you. But there's another development. The financial records tied to your husband's business show evidence of tax evasion and embezzlement. It's a growing case." Hearing those words didn't surprise me anymore. By this point, I'd come to accept that Michael wasn't just careless. He was deeply unethical. I thanked Detective Carter and hung up, my resolve hardening. I couldn't let Michael's actions drag me down any further. That afternoon, I took the first tangible step toward reclaiming my independence. I contacted a lawyer Megan had recommended, someone who specialized in both family law and financial recovery. Sitting in her office, I explained everything, from the theft of my jewelry to the unfolding police investigation. "This is a mess," she said, flipping through her notes. "But the good news is, you've already done a lot to protect yourself by going to the authorities. We can file for a formal separation and begin securing your personal assets." Hearing those words was both terrifying and empowering. I'd never imagined I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office, planning to disentangle my life from my husband's. But after everything Michael had done, I knew it was the only way forward. "What about his business?" I asked. "Could this affect me financially?" "Potentially," she replied. "That's why it's important to establish clear boundaries now. If his business is under investigation, we need to ensure your finances are protected." Later that evening, as I reviewed the paperwork the lawyer had given me, Megan called to check in. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said, surprising even myself with the honesty of the statement. "For the first time in weeks, I feel like I'm in control. It's not easy, but I know I'm doing the right thing." "You are," Megan said firmly. "And you're stronger than you realize, Helen. Don't forget that." As I hung up, I glanced at the stack of documents on the table. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. 2 days later, I met Detective Carter at the station to review the progress of the investigation. "Mrs. Parker," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him, "we've traced almost all of your jewelry and confirmed it was sold through high-value channels. The auction house and consignment stores involved have provided full cooperation." "That's a relief," I said, feeling a small weight lift off my shoulders. "And Michael? What's happening with him?" Detective Carter leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "The evidence against him is significant. Between the unauthorized sale of your jewelry and the fraud tied to his business accounts, the DA is preparing charges. He's not going to walk away from this." Hearing those words filled me with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Michael's actions had hurt me deeply, but knowing he would face consequences was a step toward justice. That evening, Michael came home late. I was sitting in the living room, surrounded by legal documents and paperwork from the bank. He stopped in the doorway, his face hard and defensive. "What is all this?" he asked, nodding toward the papers. "Divorce filings," I said evenly, not looking up from the page I was reviewing. His eyes widened, and for a moment I saw genuine shock on his face. You're divorcing me? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Yes, Michael, I said, meeting his gaze. This is the end. I won't let you drag me down with you any further. He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. You think you're going to come out of this unscathed? I built everything for us, Helen. Everything I've done was for this family. I laughed bitterly. You didn't do it for us. You did it for yourself. You stole from me, lied to me, and left me to clean up your messes. This family? It was always just about you. He stared at me, his confidence slipping away with each word. You don't mean this? He said finally. You can't mean this. I do, I said firmly, and you'll see just how serious I am when you're served. For the first time since this ordeal began, Michael was speechless. He turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I exhaled deeply, the sound of the door echoing in my ears. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of reclaiming my life. The next morning, I got a call from my lawyer. Helen, the papers have been filed. Michael will be served later today, she said, her tone professional but empathetic. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Thank you, I said softly. Helen, I know this is a tough process, she added, but you've handled this with strength and clarity. Keep focusing on your next steps. We're in your corner. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring out the window. For weeks, my life had felt like a whirlwind of betrayal, anger, and frustration. But now, for the first time, there was a sense of clarity. The pieces of my jewelry were being recovered, the police investigation was progressing, and the divorce filings marked a definitive break from the chaos Michael had brought into my life. That afternoon, Detective Carter called with more updates. Mrs. Parker, I wanted to let you know that charges are being formally filed against your husband. Between the unauthorized sale of your property and the financial fraud linked to his business accounts, he's facing multiple counts. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Does this mean I'll be able to recover everything he sold? It's likely, Detective Carter replied. The evidence is strong, and the cooperating parties have agreed to release the items back to you as soon as the case progresses. But more importantly, the justice system is holding him accountable. Thank you, I said, my voice steady. When I hung up, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't consumed by the betrayal or the need to make Michael pay. I was simply ready to move on. That evening, I met Megan for dinner. She raised her glass with a grin. To Helen, she said, the woman who didn't just survive, she thrived. I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. I don't know if I'd call it thriving just yet, but I'll take it. Megan leaned in, her expression serious. You're stronger than you think, Helen. You took control when it mattered most. Don't forget that. Her words stayed with me as I drove home that night. For years, I'd let Michael's ambition overshadow my own sense of self-worth. But now, as I looked ahead, I saw nothing but possibilities. A week later, I received a call from Detective Carter. Mrs. Parker, he said, his tone lighter than before. I wanted to let you know we've recovered all but one piece of your jewelry. The remaining item is still being traced, but the majority of your collection is ready for you to reclaim. Hearing those words felt like the final piece of a heavy burden being lifted off my shoulders. Thank you, Detective, I said, relief evident in my voice. I can't tell you how much this means to me. We're just doing our job, he replied. But if I may say, you've handled the situation with remarkable strength. Not everyone takes the steps you did. After the call, I made my way to the precinct to collect the recovered items. As I held the sapphire ring my grandmother had given me and the diamond bracelet from my mother, I felt a deep sense of closure. These weren't just pieces of jewelry. They were symbols of the life I'd worked so hard to preserve, now returned to me. The day Michael was formally charged, I received a curt message from him. You really had to drag this out, didn't you? I hope you're happy now. I didn't respond. There was no point. Michael had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. My energy was better spent on myself, on rebuilding, on moving forward. That evening, I went through the remaining paperwork with my lawyer. Once the divorce is finalized, your financial separation from him will be complete, she said. His debts won't touch you. Thank you, I said, feeling a weight lift. That's exactly what I need. It wasn't until later that night, sitting in my quiet, newly peaceful home, that I realized how much had changed. The betrayal, the anger, the hurt, it was all still there, but it no longer consumed me. I'd learned how to set boundaries, how to fight for myself, and how to let go of what I couldn't control. Megan called to check in, her usual upbeat tone lifting my spirits. So, what's next for Helen Parker? She asked. Honestly, I said, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. Anything I want. As I hung up, I looked around my home. Not just a house, but my space, reclaimed and safe. For the first time in years, I felt like I could truly breathe. Michael's actions had tested me in ways I never expected, but I'd come out stronger. And now my future was finally mine to define.